This is your first content lecture for the history of graphic design. We're going to be looking very briefly at Gutenberg through the Industrial Revolution to kind of get us on track for the 19th century, which is the main focus of Unit 1. So, overall, in Unit 1, what we are tracking is the development of graphic design as a recognizable profession. So by the early 20th century, graphic design is a career path. What happens in the 19th century to distinguish it from other art professions? And to begin to answer that question, we need to ask, what is graphic design before the 19th century? So we are not going to cover graphic design starting in cave paintings. Really, we're going to look at how it relates to book design, because before the 19th century, that's largely what it's related to. So we're going to look at technology, specifically the invention of the movable type printing press. This new technology imitates the style of handwritten books at a much lower price. However, let's note that it's still very expensive to own a book. We're going to look briefly at the three major typographic styles before the 19th century, and we're also going to look at typography as an expression of nationalist identity. So what we're looking at here is a handwritten book of hours. So this is a religious text that was written by professional scribes. It would take at least a month to produce, and that's if you're working constantly at it. It requires a lot of training to produce something like this. You have to be trained in producing those letters and producing the artwork. Everything about these handwritten books are incredibly expensive and precious and rare. So that's what the movable press is trying to replace, basically. So, movable type is a system and technology of printing and typography that uses movable components to reproduce the letters and punctuation of a document. And so what we're looking at here is movable type. You can see the individual letters and commas all have their own blocks. This is similar to the type of innovation developed by Johann Gutenberg in 1450. This is a useful slide for some of the terminology around type, but basically the thing I want you to get from this is that movable type in some ways is sculptural, because you have to actually make the individual letters, you have to carve them, and then you need to pour molten metal into the carved blocks in order to create this movable type. And so there's an element of this that is very, very much, it's artistic, because you're like literally sculpting these letters. So Gutenberg is best known for his Bible. That's what we're looking at here. And what's interesting about this, or what I want you to notice, is look at those letters. Do those letters look like they were produced by a printing press? Not exactly. And that's because Gutenberg, Fust, and Schoeffer are very deliberately imitating the appearance of handwritten books. So they're trying to copy the calligraphic writing of medieval scribes. This type of font is called black letter because of it uses a lot of black ink. Sometimes it's called textura because it has this textured look, the spiky letter forms. This is another example of a hand-produced book. This is a very famous book by the Limburg brothers that has exceptional illustrations, all produced by hand. Really gorgeous, gorgeous book. Wildly expensive. What we're looking at here is the first book printed with the movable type printing press to imitate that type of hand illustrated book. So this is a combination of movable type and woodcuts. What's represented here is the Nuremberg Chronicle, and it had a history of the world in different cities. And it used woodcuts, which are also reproducible, and that's how they would show the different cities. So what we're looking at here is Venice. This one is hand-colored, so that would make it more expensive. And you could buy a less expensive one that was just black and white. Now, these are less expensive than a hand-produced book, but they're still very expensive, and they still take a while to produce before you have really good, efficient processes. Perhaps the most famous use of the Gutenberg press is by Martin Luther. He used it to produce his Bible in German, and he uses that same black letter type. The new term for it is Fraktur. Fracture means broken, and it references all black letter scripts after 1450. And because Luther uses this for his German language Bible, Fraktur or black letter becomes associated with German culture. So moving forward, when people see this type of text, it makes them think of Germany, largely because of its association with German printers. And so on the right, you can see I have an example of black letter, and it shows you kind of how you can recognize it. It has these really big differences between the thick and the thin strokes. And then there's these diagonal, very thin serifs on the lowercase letters. However, so it's associated with Germany, but like honestly, so many, like today, newspapers around the world use black letter for their mastheads. So the association with German culture isn't really accurate anymore, but in the 19th century, it comes to have that association. So elsewhere, a very different type of typography develops. The Renaissance in Italy is understood as a time when there's this great interest in classical antiquity, by which I mean ancient Greece and Rome. So scholars start using a handwriting called humanist minuscule because it imitates ancient Roman typography. It's a way that they're showing their erudition and their scholarship and their interest in the ancient world. Printers imitate that handwriting to create a typography called the Old Style. We'll be looking at those in a moment. And this presents an alternative to the black letter type produced north of the Alps, and it's happening like simultaneously with the black letter type. So this is Jensen. You've probably heard of this before. And these are Roman type letters. They're associated with the Renaissance in Italy, and they imitate, again, handwriting. And so you see that at its beginning, this book design is really trying to imitate hand-produced books. Here's another style called Bembo, which you might have heard of, and I bring this one up because Bembo is very popular in France as well, where Claude Garamond develops a similar font known as Garamond. And so you can see how the part of what makes this nationalist is that it becomes associated with Italy, and then it's the Italian style that ends up migrating to France. France becomes a really important place for the history of graphic design, largely because it's a very important place for the visual arts in general. And that's largely because of Louis XIV. So that's a painting of him by Hyacinthe Rigaud, and you can see how fabulous he is and how fabulous he thinks he is. He's known as the Sun King because he insists on his absolute God-given power. This is a response to all of the political instability that preceded his reign. And so he really clamps down on that and institutes an incredible measure of control that everybody else in Europe wants to imitate. Now that control extends to the arts, which he harnesses for service to the state. He establishes an Academy of Fine Arts to control art making, basically to make sure that all the art that's being produced in France reflects well upon France. Graphic design also becomes part of his control, as we'll be seeing, and really France now becomes the arbiter of taste. Everybody around Europe is looking to France to see what is good art supposed to be, what is good graphic design supposed to be. And this is a moment that's called the transitional style. And the typography that we're looking at here is called the Roman du Roi, which means Roman of the king. It is a Roman style, just like the old style we were looking at before, but Louis XIV wants to have a very clear-cut typography that's associated with him, and he wants to be able to control it. And how do you control that? You need to make sure that people imitate it perfectly. And the way that he ensures that, or the way his designer ensures that, is by using these graphs. Look at the way every single letter every letter form fits into a grid that's reproducible, and that ensures consistency across all of the lettering produced for Louis XIV. This becomes really important because it makes it reproducible, and that begins a process by which you can pay to use a certain type of typography. So here, this is an encyclopedic survey of typography from 1766, and what you'll see that's important here is it includes all of the measurements of different types of typography. And I love this picture here because you can see the little putti playing with the individual bits of type down in the lower right. So by the early 19th and late 18th century, we now have the modern Roman type. So in some ways it's similar to black letter because look at how there's this extreme contrast between the thick and the thin, but you can see it's still very much firmly rooted in the Roman style. So it has that humanist minuscule appearance. So as we conclude the 18th and moving into the 19th century, let's review what our skill set is. So graphic designers have practical knowledge, right? They need to be able to reproduce their objects. They need to be able to engineer and use this press. However, they have to be creative also. There's a sculptural quality to what they're doing. And then finally, that grid form that we saw before demonstrates how they must also have the logic of a scientist. These graphic designers, what they're producing is largely applying to books and government objects, government documents. That's going to change in the 19th century because you have the development of the steam-driven printing press, and that completely transforms the number of objects that you can produce. And so we start to see graphic design used not just for books and for documents, but for commerce and advertising. And that's where we'll start in the 19th century.